All right, welcome back. We're here, special guest, Brian's house. We've gone mobile today, folks. Couldn't resist getting up to Brian's place and spending a little time with my good friend and discussing a few things. Had to grab the recorder before I got too far because we were missing some gold here. Brian, a couple of things have come up recently in the news feeds. Definitely know that you keep up to speed on this sort of thing. Let's start with some of the more comical notes. The trip to India. I mean, Justin Trudeau, the ceremonial garb that was worn for in excess of 5 or 6 days, the costs involved in that, and the embarrassment that I think many Canadians might feel. What are your thoughts on that trip to India?
Well, I don't find that his pandering is particularly useful, nor do I think it's particularly dignified. I mean, if he'd stepped off the plane in Scotland and been wearing a kilt and a feather bonnet around, it would have been exactly the same thing, and he'd have been roundly mocked for it, as he should be. And they did so in India, and they did so without any input from conservatives or the right wing in Canada or any of that kind of thing. He was mocked roundly because it displayed a great deal of immaturity and a lack of depth and seriousness required for the position. Every time a politician puts on a costume, it's the potential for embarrassment. Everyone's been there. Stephen Harper's been there. Jean Chrétien's been there. God knows they've all been there in the States. So you don't put a costume on. But, there's almost kind of a pandering racism that Trudeau comes out with. It's like you have to be overly nice and suck up to people so they'll like you, else you're a racist, which I think is in its own way a reverse racism. India is an incredibly interesting country with an ancient culture, and to have some foppish Frenchmen, and I'm French, so I can speak on this. Show up wearing Bollywood clothing and carrying on and dancing the Bhangra and like just
stop.
Where did we go off the rails? How did we end up with this clownish buffoon representing us on the world stage? I've heard people say, well, I'm just glad Harper's gone because Canada is just nicer. Nicer? We're ridiculous. We've become a joke. We were a grown-up country with serious issues, and we were being dealt with in the world as if we had interesting and important things to say. And now everyone's just turned their backs to us once again because we're ultimately quite unimportant. We're a very small country. We're smaller than some cities, and population-wise. And we've gone back to being unserious and really kind of irrelevant. And I'm just hoping this phenomenon will move on its way and we'll get back to having a real government in 2019 and whatever that looks like. And I will say this. I had this conversation with some friends last night. We have had decent liberal caretaker governments.
Yes.
If you don't want to be enamored of Stephen Harper, that's fine. You don't have to be enamored of him. However, he did a decent job holding the line, making sure that things stayed under control, security was reasonable, taxes were reasonable, the economy was reasonable. Canada did pretty well under him. Yes, our overall debt went up, but we went through a very, very difficult economic time, and we came out of it in good shape, and we were looked at on the world stage with a great deal of credibility. And we have had liberal governments who have done the same. Paul Martin's government did that. Jean Chrétien's government did that. There have been good liberal governments. So if you have liberal listeners, I don't want them thinking I'm just whacking away in this. But there is no question this is the worst thing that has ever happened to Canada in modern times in view of governments. And whatever people think of the experiment, it needs to end, and we need to go on with serious governance in 2019.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. Just about everywhere. we're just not being taken seriously anymore. I mean, it's obvious. I had very little interest in politics. In fact, I was the total opposite end of the spectrum. I didn't want to know anything about politics. I'm forced to pay attention to politics now because of the things I'm seeing. Certainly, embarrassment is the first word that comes to mind when I see him dancing and, as you put it, carrying on stage, and in that ceremonial garb, which I'm sure could have a legitimate place in a visit overseas to a foreign land, in some sort of effort to show respect for tradition and culture. I get it. And I don't want to be overly critical, but at some point, though, you just got to turn it off and realize that it might be patronizing, that it might be insulting, that maybe perhaps people are going to see through the facade, that you are a joke, you really don't know what you're doing, and quite honestly, you shouldn't be in that position. I always had my doubts about a drama teacher. Not that I have anything against drama teachers, but to have somebody that perhaps with a very limited experience, practical experience relating to politics, being put in such a powerful position. I'm sure his exposure to politics was great as a child. But to actually put a man in that position and to watch these events unfold before my very eyes, I mean, everything that's happened just seems to be this train wreck that I just can't stop watching. Kind of reminds me of Jersey Shore. I used to watch Jersey Shore back in the day, and I mean, awful show, terrible if you want to call it acting, if it's a reality TV show or not. I'm sure there's a lot of people that would dispute that it's not, but I watched that show, and I continuously watch that show because it was just so bad it was good. Now I find myself watching Canadian politics because it's just so ridiculous. I've never seen more mistakes made. I've never seen more ridiculous effort to try and sort of mask incompetence. And
it's become very unserious. And
yeah,
and the government has a role, and they have a job. And let's be very clear here: they work for us.
Yeah.
They don't rule us. They work for us. We're their bosses. They're our employees. We don't serve them. They serve us. And this elitist strutting around with the gold credit card, just partying it up, the childish, amateurish way that governance is being pursued at this time in this country is beneath contempt. And I've reflected on this a lot, and I've had to think a lot about it, as I think everyone should. And I think here's the thing, is that we shouldn't become so consumed with rage and hatred and prejudice, if you will, towards this joke of a government that we have right now, and this system that's going on right now, this thing. I don't know what it is.
Yeah, I'm not sure how to identify it either.
It's a joke. It really is. So I think what's really important now is, instead of getting angry and getting full of rage and spending all your time online memeing and getting in arguments with people, I think what's very important is the only chance we have to make any positive change here is to engage intelligently in trying to educate people as to the real nature of things. So this is not a good government. They are not doing good things for Canada. The only way we are going to get them out is if we convince other Canadians of the same. We're not going to do it by minimizing their concerns or insulting them, or in minimizing, so-called progressive values or any of that kind of stuff. The only thing we're going to be able to do is to emphasize that they're harming Canadian politics, they're harming international trade, they're harming our social fabric, and I don't mean that in the conservative sense. What our society consists of and how it operates is always open to debate and interpretation. There's all kinds of things we can change to make things better. There are some things that are going to get changed that are going to make things worse, and that's always an open debate. But this friggin' train wreck that we have going on now needs to be opposed, and the only chance we have with any sense of reason is to try and dialogue with people and to educate them and to convince them to vote differently. And that's it. That's the only thing we can do.
You know what? I mean, again, you know, as I am most days, I'm in complete agreement with you. I think that education and you know, raising the level of awareness. I find a lot of people are just completely oblivious to what's going on. They're not watching the parliamentary sessions. They're not paying close attention to the news, which might be a byproduct of actually worrying about how you're going to pay your next hydro bill. Well, quite frankly, I mean, like people are scrambling in this country to, you know, make ends meet. You know, quite a few of us are out there worried more about, you know, how we're going to pay the bills than perhaps paying attention to global politics and or Canadian politics, when in fact I don't think it's ever been more important than it is now, than to watch these things and to pay attention to what's going on. Because quite honestly, I've never seen you know, a bigger train wreck, and I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. It's so horrible to watch. I mean, from everything from embarrassing behavior to just outlandishly dangerous. Like, I mean, when you start to examine things like the extension of an invitation to a convicted terrorist to, you know, a dinner function.
Trudeau seems to be real keen on terrorists.
Yeah,
and that right there, a person who has no tolerance for someone who disagrees with him on policy or disagrees with him on philosophy, but is perfectly okay in hanging out with people who murder our friends,
yes,
and who murder our soldiers, and who would wage war and commit violence on our society and on our culture. I'm sorry, you're worse than they are.
Yeah,
you are worse than they are.
Well, for the people that are listening that maybe don't keep up to speed on these sort of things, my understanding, and it's a very limited understanding, I don't ever profess to be an intelligent person, and certainly I don't sit here and say that I keep up on every last thing that happens, but my understanding is that a man who shot someone on Canadian soil, an Indian gentleman, and I use that term loosely because I don't think he qualifies. He shot someone on Canadian soil. He's essentially a convicted terrorist, and somebody saw fit to invite him to a function while our Prime Minister was visiting in India. Well, how do they miss that? I'm not sure I understand.
So let's be fair here, okay? Because if we want to hammer this guy,
yeah,
we have to be fair. I'm sure that the vetting for Stephen Harper's you know, visits list you know, was probably tighter than Trudeau's, but I'll bet some questionable people might have made it through from time to time, and there's a real problem with gotcha politics.
Yep.
There really is, because you know, running a country is a big job.
Yes.
And this plays out really well for the opposition, because it just looks like a total scumbag move on his part. And
well, you know what? Hold on. I'm gonna interrupt you for 1 second, only because you know, I made a career out of being fair to people, and you know, I think it's fair that when you're in a public position, and you know, especially when you're fond of selfies, that you may occasionally be caught you know, standing next to somebody that you shouldn't be. You know, I've certainly in my day, I've been out and I've been standing next to people I didn't know who they were, and or people have said, you know, do you mind if I get a picture with you? Or, and I imagine the Prime Minister's in the same boat. You know, you can't be aware of everybody that's around you, you know, and their background and their history. But I mean, to have like a known terrorist, right? Somebody who's actually shot somebody, was convicted, was imprisoned for shooting someone. You know, and to hear that, you know, this person's not too popular with the Indian communities, that person, you know, shot another Indian. Was it a diplomat or what? But to actually be standing next to this man, to have known ties to somebody that's connected to terrorism, and I mean, again, we repetitively see this theme: the payouts to Qatar. you know, standing next to Atwal, you know, while he's in India. I mean, there's just so many like disastrous kind of moves on this government's part and on Trudeau's part. You know, I mean, even to the smallest things, like, I mean, flying a chef, you know, a gourmet chef to India. I mean, what was he afraid that he wasn't going to be able to find a traditional meal in India?
This has always been my issue with the Liberals. You know, this is not about politics. This is about power. Liberals are salesmen, as are conservatives, and Liberals sell themselves to the so-called progressive group of people who need to feel better about themselves. They like to convince themselves that they know what's better for everyone, and that their ideas will simply help lift everyone out of you know, tougher times. And it is completely contemptible. It's you know, it's not true. And the fact of the matter is that because the Liberals have been in power longer, they're far more ingrained with corruption, graft, and they're tied into questionable, murky groups. You know, a lot of organized crime, a lot of that kind of thing, a lot of sticky fingers in the pot. And because there's a lot of money to steal, and of course now there's no money, there's just a credit balance on a credit card that is run through the friggin' ceiling. That's all there is. But this is about being in power, and you know, from a government, the last government that purported to want to serve the people, that always said that they were employees of ours, that they considered us the bosses, that wanted to give more of our tax dollars back, that wanted to spend money more responsibly, that wanted to ensure that our natural resources and our industries could operate successfully, and they could operate, you know, unfettered by restrictive policies that made it difficult for them to compete against our neighbors. Because let's face it, we're up against the United States, we're up against China, and I mean, we're a tiny country. It's very hard for our industries to compete in that market, you know, and to be constantly vilified and attacked for, you know, environmental issues, and I mean, you know, frankly, the whole carbon tax thing is ridiculous. It's you know, it's just an excuse to grab more money and to spend it however they wish. So you know. And don't get me wrong, I'm an environmentalist. I'm a real environmentalist. I've spent a lot of time out in the wilderness, and I really enjoy it. And I've never left a crumb of garbage out there.
Yeah.
And I've seen some of these so-called environmentalists go have the little protests and leave garbage strewn from one end of the street to the next, and then tell me about how I you know, the
how irresponsible you are.
How irresponsible and how bad for the environment, you know, the conservatives are. Is ridiculous. Completely contemptible.
Well, you know, certainly I've seen a lot of things that you know, demand some answers. I've never seen a government so willing, right, to drive the ship right into the docks. I mean, like, every time I turn around, there's another mistake being made. I just wish...
And they revel in them. Like, they just, in for a penny, in for a pound.
Yeah. Like, I mean, you know, I do, believe it or not, I do listen to the podcasts that we record, and, you know, one standout phrase that stood out in my mind was doubling down on stupid. Oh. You know, like, you literally, I want to put that hashtag and put it on the back of a t-shirt. Folks, if you'll buy one, I'll sell them, because I've never heard something that rings more true of today's Canadian government. Doubling down on stupid. Like, I mean, every time I turn around, there just seems to be another grotesque error in judgment. You know, to make decisions that fly in the face of all reason, to have people, you know, not vetted correctly, and to invite a terrorist to a function that you're at. I mean, forget the safety. I mean, just the optics. I mean, it's just horrible to see.
It's very difficult to hold these people to account when all the media is in on it. You know, the government's talking about underwriting the print industry, the you know, the print magazine and newspaper industry, and you know, you wonder why all the newspapers support the Liberals, and why CBC supports the Liberals. You know, I mean, they're being paid by them, let's face it, right? Their budget comes from them, and conservatives say they'll cut the budget, so you're not getting any positive press from the CBC. But, you know, they have their fingers in everything. The CBC, CTV, Global News, Torstar, you know, everything. There's a tiny conservative news presence in Canada. Everything else is just a wash of liberal white noise. And these people can carry on like the buffoons they are and they get away with it. And you know how they keep our minds off it, Mark?
Oh.
Well, what about Trump? Look what Trump's doing.
Yeah.
Trump is a clown.
Yeah.
Trump is this and Trump is that. Well, I have friends who have carried on daily on their Facebooks about what Trump's up to, completely ignoring what our own clown in chief is doing in Ottawa. And you know, listen, people, we have to be smarter than this. Like, you know, if they're putting bells and whistles over here, then you ought to be looking what's going on in the shadows over there, because that's where the real news is.
Yeah.
It's not where the bells and whistles are. The truth is, I'm really concerned about what's going on in Ottawa right now while he's over there dancing the Bhangra in a crazy friggin' orange clown outfit. Because this is the thing. What's coming our way? I'll tell you. There's some legislation coming down that's going to set this country on edge.
Yeah.
Over all kinds of things. And I know that it's been created and moved forward while everyone was busy looking at his antics.
Yeah, I'm sensing a little sleight of hand going on here, folks. You know, my 20 years in policing taught me one thing. When you see somebody doing something that looks completely outlandish and strange, start to look around the room, because you know what? They might just be, right, an organized distraction. And I mean, if you've watched people steal things, and I certainly have, gone over my fair share of surveillance footage, inevitably the most successful thieves, right, and dishonest people work in concert with one another in teams, and they love to use the distraction method, which is very basic and simple. Cause a ruckus over here, and no matter what you're doing, if it's outlandish enough, people will watch it and they won't notice the simplest thing that's going on behind them, which is robbing them blind, and or putting something over on them that you would have never let fly under normal circumstances. So here we have, our illustrious leadership over on the other side of the world, looking like, for lack of a better term, a complete retard. And thankfully, the Globe seems to be recognizing it as such. And to watch him doing that, you take a look around, and you touched on the subject of, purchased media. For the people out there that only listen to one type of news or only listen to one venue, again, I would echo your sentiments. You said watch a number of different sources of media, to actually look at independent media and people that aren't potentially paid by the government, that might have, a slanted view of what is reality. I mean, if you're getting your paycheck from someplace, you might not want to bite the hand that feeds you. So we've got a number of major news outlets that may have questionable credibility. Certainly for me.
Well, Mark, and here's the thing: if you're gonna watch CBC and CTV and Global and get your news from that and consider that to be real news, that's fine. But you need to watch The Rebel, and you need to read Sun. And I mean, my problem with those news organizations is I don't particularly like reading news that. First of all, I know they're trying to get a rise out of people, so I know that it's a little bit over the top. And I also don't particularly enjoy news that is dumbing down and simplifying issues, because that's not fair either. But I think if you're going to watch the CBC, and let's be fair, there's some great people at CBC. Rex Murphy's knocking it out of the park. He's knocking it out of the park these days. But I mean, if you're gonna read the Toronto Star, read the National Post. If you're gonna, watch CBC and CTV, you gotta watch the Rebel. You've got to watch some of the right wing news. If you're gonna watch CNN. Which is horrifically bad news, people. If you don't realize it, it's Jerry Springer. It's Jerry Springer.
I used to be one of those
that bad.
I used to be one of those people that thought CNN was gospel.
CNN was. But
what happened?
Well, it figured out that its bread was buttered in a certain way, and they went whole hog on that.
Wow.
But the thing is, it is Jerry Springer now. So if you're going to watch CNN, you got to watch Fox. Yeah. You got to balance it out. And at least in the States, they have that option. And I have lots of liberal friends who, oh my God, it was like Fox News. Listen. If you're going to watch CNN and take it as gospel and then mock Fox News, then you're part of the problem.
Yeah.
You're a moron. Because if you think that Fox News is fake and CNN is the truth, you're an idiot. You need to know that just because people are saying what you may naturally agree with doesn't mean it's the truth. And what you need to do is hear the opposite side, and then you gotta work your way through the fog of the narrative, because the truth is in there somewhere. The kernel of the story is in there, but it's being presented left and it's being presented right, and just most of it's crap now.
And speaking of truth, speaking of fake news, certainly I got smacked a couple of times. A number of people on Facebook. God love Facebook people. They're never afraid to express themselves.
Very tough.
Yeah, could be a tough crowd over there on Facebook. I don't spend as much time on Facebook as perhaps I should. I love social media. I've grown to love it, but certainly I've seen a number of things occurring in the news feeds that draw my attention. Not the least of which is Justin Trudeau meeting with executives from Facebook. And the idea that perhaps this government may decide to lock down. I remember there was the people kind comment. Justin Trudeau interrupted somebody in a town meeting when they referred to mankind as mankind, and of course he claimed it was a joke, and perhaps it was. I don't know. I don't believe anything that comes out of that man's mouth anymore, but he claimed it was a joke when he interrupted the female, saying, "We like to use the term people kind." And in this effort to rewrite the English dictionary, Justin Trudeau may have completely stepped on his own penis, folks, when he corrected a young lady and referred to mankind as people kind, and quite honestly, in my opinion, entered into the height of stupid political correctness territory. And of course, it was followed up immediately by some kind of statement via Twitter by Gerald Butts, saying something to the effect of, people that criticize his boss, and the rebel media are Nazis, and of course I jumped on the bandwagon like anybody else, and I did a couple of memes, and of course I had my fair share of detractors and people that criticized me for doing that. Folks, if you can't take a joke, tough luck. I'm gonna do those occasionally. But your thoughts on the idea that perhaps Justin Trudeau and government might like to step into the ring in social media and perhaps censor what goes on there. I mean, I've always known that social media is the thread that binds us. It's a way to get the word out there. It's independent. It's they can't control it the way they do perhaps the big news media outlets with their budgets. To have Justin Trudeau perhaps recognizing, and his government recognizing, that social media may be the one last kind of bastion of honesty out there. I mean, in addition to all the fake news and the nonsense that's circulating, you may actually get a lot of the truth, and to actually bring that embarrassing behavior to the forefront, and to bring it to the masses, and to let people know that the Canadian government is now the laughing stock in the global place of politics. What are your thoughts on the idea that they would step in?
Well, I mean, I find that Facebook is questionable at best. Anyway, I mean, they're censoring themselves, and obviously the Mark Zuckerberg has his own opinions about how the world should be run and how it should go down, and he's very American liberal, and the fact that that's not liberal enough for Justin Trudeau is kind of hilarious. But Facebook is not a good source for news. It's a great source for opinion, which of course there's too much of out there. So, I think disconnecting a little bit is get back to looking at people's vacation pics and their dinner pics rather than listening to them rant about, a million times a day you're going to hear a dear friend of yours say something that pisses you off. That's the problem with Facebook.
Yeah.
So you're always surrounded by all this nonsense and negativity, and it's I don't want to be bombarded with fuzzy kittens and love and philosophical pearls of wisdom every 3 seconds. Like, man, I just want to see your camping pictures. I don't care about I don't need to be reminded that listen, I woke up with a migraine today, and I got some bills I'm going to have trouble paying this week, but I want to hear about how great life is. See a nice picture of a calm lake, and, you know, isn't it tremendous? You know, it's like, yeah, life is great. It's wonderful. But, you know, we've all got our own spheres of sort of labor to concentrate on, and minimizing that with these platitudes and this, you know, campy sort of romanticism about everything is just a waste of time as well. It's you know what it is? It's advertising mediocrity.
Yeah.
So like
I like knowing what people had for lunch. You know, the first 2 days of the week, but if you're going to tell me and give me updates as to every last thing,
3 meals a day.
You know, unless you're going to all the cool restaurants, and I'm, you know, trying to decide what I want to eat that week. I mean,
but you know, it's pretty tough to listen to some high school kid talk about, you know, what we should be doing for foreign diplomacy, or, you know, what the answer to all society's ills are. Like some junior kid in university. Seriously, some undergrad in history criticized Jordan Peterson this week, and it was funny because Dr. Peterson didn't have to defend himself. Someone did it for him, and they said, you know, isn't it just wonderful that an undergrad can go after a man with a PhD and with 30 years of experience in his work field, to be told that he doesn't know what he's talking about by a 19 or 20-year-old undergrad.
You mean between eating Tide Pods?
Exactly. Well, that's, you know, it's like the Tide Pod generation is going to tell us what we need to do about gun control, or what we need to do about money, you know, or income distribution, or whatever. Like, you know, people. The young are our future, but they need to shut up and learn some things. Yes. They really do. And you know what?
I'm so glad you said it like that, because you know what? Honestly, folks, one of the things that I've come into contact with over the years is that new guy, that guy that's been around since lunch hour, the guy that, you know, I've got more, like, you know, overtime hours logged on than he's been on the job, and you know, he's got an opinion suddenly. You know what? Shut up. And for this young generation that wants to weigh in on serious conversation and to tangle,
whoa, listen,
right, with a guy with a PhD that's that brilliant, in my opinion.
By all means, you're welcome to have an opinion, but it should be an informed opinion.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, when you hear some of these, you know, singers and artists and stuff, you know, 17, 18 years old, Lorde, she was 17, and she had some comment about American foreign policy. It's like, really, Lorde? What do you know about it? You've spent your entire life in vocal, you know, studies and studios, singing and recording, and I guess all that time in front of a microphone and in writing songs, you just got this insight into international diplomacy that just, you know, gives you the authority to go out there and speak to your millions of fans and tell them that what you think the U.S. is doing is wrong. You know, like, shut up.
Yeah, you know what? See, you took the words right out of my mouth. Shut up is actually what come out of my mouth just a second ago. You know, I'm really always glad to sit down and talk with you, Brian. And I mean, some of the things that we've talked about here always, you know, leave me with the impression that I've left here just a little bit smarter, perhaps, than when I arrived. You know, moving right along though, last thing on the agenda, and something, you know, very serious, and it's very important. The shooting in the U.S. All right, your first take on, you know, what's going on down there, how it might have an impact potentially on us up here. I mean, people have been for months, you know, speculating as to what the Canadian government might be dropping on its legal gun ownership and its population. We've got the shooting in the U.S. Okay, and certainly that's not us. We have a completely different set of rules, people. Like, we are not the United States of America. I mean, they certainly have their interesting strengths, and you know, like, I see a system that potentially could be tweaked. Not potentially for the Canadian system. Is it going to be the same, you know, as it is down there? They've got a different set of values. They've got a different history than we do. There are some parallels, however. You know, looking at what's going on down there and the way it might impact us, what are you thinking about, you know, that school shooting? I mean, that's something I've wanted to talk about for a while.
Well, these are going to continue happening, and you know, we spoke on one of the earlier podcasts about, you know, what's going to happen with our gun laws, and you know, and I said, well, just wait till the next school shooting, because it's, you know, every time this happens, this is a huge win for the forces of the left that want to disarm us and that want to impose their philosophical views on us. You know, and it's hypocritical to the extreme. So, my thoughts on the school shooting. Well, I'll tell you, all the lefties think that this is another example of what free access to firearms causes, and that the military style weapons don't belong in the public, and this is why we have the police. Well, I'll tell you, your narrative is screwed. You just disproved your whole argument, because the police did nothing. They stood and watched while 17 kids got murdered. 17 kids who could do nothing about it. Their teachers and their school staff, their the maintenance staff, the security, nobody could do anything about it except get killed because they weren't allowed to have guns. Right? Now, listen, I'm not saying everyone needs to wear guns. I don't particularly think that students should have guns. And I actually don't think that teachers should have them either, unless, of course, they want to have them, which is a different thing. I would not particularly like to see my teacher up at the front of the class wearing a sidearm. I don't think it's necessary. And it becomes a focus rather than the lesson. But to say that the principal or the deputy principal, the vice principal, or one of the guidance counselors or a maintenance guy, or even vetted and hired proper security staff who are professionally trained and properly armed, would be able to defend a school a lot better than nothing. And now this point was raised. People said, well, you don't want to turn schools into armed camps and so on and so forth. And here's the thing. So Israel suffered a number of very serious school attacks about 30, 40 years ago. And they lost a bunch of children murdered by Palestinian terrorists. And they said, okay, well, schools are a soft target, and this is an issue. So we're going to revamp the entire way that we do school security.
Yep.
And they went with armed staff.
And?
They went with armed staff, and they went with... they hardened the targets up so that they were more difficult to get into, and they controlled access to the schools.
Yeah.
And they put in place a whole bunch of security measures that would stop the attacks. They didn't ban guns, right? They didn't ban guns. They said, well, if you're a Palestinian terrorist, you can't have a gun.
Yeah.
But if you're an Israeli citizen, you can, even if you're an Arab, right? And you can serve in the Israeli military. You can serve in Israeli parliament. You can do all these things. So they did what was necessary to do to protect their population, their children.
You know what? It's funny. Just to bust off onto a side note here. Looking back on some of the podcasts and listening to them, a subject came up that recently that blew me away, because what I heard was that Ralph Goodell and the Office of Emergency Preparedness shot down some kind of petition or bid to have off-duty police officers carrying their guns. I remember having, in this very spot, I sat with you and we discussed the possibility of how we might improve, security for our country, for our people, and to, improve, a response to perhaps an armed attack. And one of the things that you came up with, and I've got to tell you, buddy, I've always considered you brilliant, is to actually give authorization to off-duty police officers to carry their sidearms while they're not working. And what the term that you used was, you will quadruple effectively the armed effective response to terrorist threats. And
without it costing a dime.
Without it costing a dime.
Won't cost a dime.
And that idea was shot down. And it was shot down because it's my understanding that a number of yes,
it's philosophy.
It's his philosophy. The argument is that too many police officers have been charged in the past with assaults, with domestics.
Then I don't want them being cops.
Well, yeah. If you can't trust them 24 hours, they're expected to be police officers 24 hours a day. I know I used to be one of them. And if something went down next to you, you were expected to act. And yet, here we are giving these people potentially the ability to respond, right, in a way that could be effective. And we're denying them that, and we're denying the Canadian public that. And it's something that you brought up. And isn't it interesting that just the other day I heard that idea had been shot down wholeheartedly. And I don't know how much consideration it was truly given, but I got to tell you, sad.
Here's a case in point. So when the attack happened on Parliament, and the sergeant at arms was able to kill the assailant, sergeant at arms doesn't wear a sidearm. He doesn't wear a firearm. He had a firearm in his desk, which was the place that it was to be, and it was part of his job. But that firearm was secured in his desk,
and he had to recover that.
He had to recover it and respond to the threat. Nevertheless, at least he had the option to do that. And who's to say that that wouldn't work in a school situation, or that wouldn't work in a hospital situation, or that wouldn't work in one of a dozen situations? At least it's an option. And the you know, the same people who say we shouldn't have access to firearms, or we shouldn't carry firearms, we shouldn't have firearms around, think it's a wonderful idea that we have AEDs in the public, because having immediate medical intervention can save a person's life in a crisis. But they don't, and that's why we have fire extinguishers around, right? Because you don't want to wait for the fire department. The fire's now, we can ameliorate it before it gets out of control. But when it comes to an armed, or like, it doesn't have to be a firearm. It could be a guy running around with a knife or a baseball bat who's gone absolutely batshit crazy, running around with a chainsaw, carrying on. Maybe it's just a big guy running around hammering people with his hands or a board. At least if you've got an option somewhere that you can respond with, you know, you are shortening the time and lessening the amount of damage done. The police take, what, Mark, you were a cop, 6 minutes, 8 minutes to get to some calls?
You're looking at a major metropolitan city between 4 to 6 minutes response time for something of that nature. You've got to gather people, right, and then coordinate to go inside,
right,
and that's 4 to 6 minutes minimum. No time to call in the SWAT team, folks. None of this shoot them in the leg stuff.
Well, and again, you know, like
minutes count.
In Florida, they had an armed officer on the grounds, a police officer, not a security guard, police officer on the grounds, who failed to take action. He stayed outside of the school while the shooting went on. I don't know if he was paralyzed by fear, if their policy dictated that he didn't respond until he had backup, or what. But he didn't go in. 4 deputies show up to help him. They didn't go in. They set up a perimeter and they stayed outside. And to turn around and say to people that you can't be armed, that you don't have the right to protect yourself, but we're going to turn this into an issue of the Second Amendment and of the NRA and of guns in American society, and we're going to allow people to be massacred to make a point, which I think may be what happened. And I at the very least, the Broward County Sheriff should resign his damn job. Yeah. I don't care. Like, maybe it's more insidious than that. Maybe it is more insidious than that. I don't need to put a tinfoil hat on here, but did they deliberately know this kid was going to go off and they were trying to make a political point? Is that what it was? Is it maybe this? Because I'll tell you, there's some real insidious people on the left. There's some real scumbag thinking over there. And, you know, did this guy want to make the point? Well, these dummies don't want to ban guns. Well, we'll give them their massacre and then they can make their decisions then. Did he do that? Maybe not. But it's certainly not outside the realm of possibility. At the very least, an extremely ignorant and irresponsible attitude towards policing and security governed his organization that led to the deaths of a bunch of children. It wasn't the NRA. It wasn't the NRA. It wasn't the AR-15. It was a kid who'd had 29 visits from the police, who had numerous times not been charged because it was a decision of the Democratic, this so-called left-wing liberal school board in Broward County, that they did not want legal interventions with the children when they got in trouble with the law, and the officers were directed to disengage and to allow it to go and to not charge these kids. So a number of times when he could have been stopped, when he could have received the help he needed or been punished for his behavior, they failed to take action, to the point where it led to him not having his firearms taken away from him. He did pass a background check to get that firearm, and then was able to use it, and when he was using it, was not confronted by the law enforcement that was on scene. And it was the officers from the next county over that showed up, went in guns a-blazing. Like, they went in, guns drawn, ran right past the deputies that were outside, went in to deal with the shooting, to confront and kill the bad guy. And the argument that this is somehow the NRA or the AR-15, they've like anyone on the left who argues that has completely lost their logic circuits. the argument is that if anyone in there had been armed, they might have been at least been able to protect their own lives.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, this whole idea of the good guy with a gun. Well, yeah. And the good guy with a gun happens a lot. And you don't get told that in the media because that's not the narrative the media wants to push. It happens a lot. They say upwards of 2.5 million defenses of uses of firearms a year in the United States. But the issue is, well, you tell me a mass shooting that was stopped with a gun. Well, they can't because they weren't mass shootings because someone stopped them with a gun.
Yeah.
Right? It's some guy shot another guy and it was over.
Yeah.
It wasn't a guy shot 28 people dead because no one was there with a gun. And all these shootings happen in gun-free zones. All of them. All of them. And not only that, if you really want to stop mass shootings, well, I'll be a jerk for a minute. You want to stop mass shootings, anyone who's a registered Democrat should not be allowed to own a firearm. Right there will stop 90% of the shootings in the United States.
Yeah.
No, and it's not even a joke.
No,
it's
true.
90% of shootings in the United States are carried out by registered members of the Democratic Party. 100% of the shootings in the United States are carried out by people who are on psychotropic meds.
Yeah.
100%. Now, that's mass shootings. I'm not talking about the gangbangers. I'm talking all the mass shootings, of which there are not that many. Let's talk real numbers here. Less than 350 people a year are killed in the United States with assault rifles. Okay? We keep hearing 30,000. No. 350 people a year are killed in the United States from assault rifles. 350 in a country of 360 million people. Okay? So, do your math. Now, 30,000, it's gone up and down between 16 to 30,000 for gun deaths overall in the United States. 20,000 of those are suicides. Right? People say, wow, yeah, Japan doesn't have any gun suicides. Nope, they don't. They have even more other types of suicides. So it's not about the gun. So you have to take the suicides out of it. So now you're down to 10,000 deaths a year. In a country of 360 million people, that's not all that high. But now let's go. 75% of those shootings are gang-on-gang violence. You're not going to change that. And those shootings happen in predominantly no-gun ownership areas. Chicago, Philadelphia, L.A., like places where you are not allowed to own handguns, and or they have, other than that, they have very, very tight gun control. 75% of those shootings are gang-on-gang, and they're going to happen anyway.
Yeah. Even
if guns are completely banned. If they were happening in Britain, it would be the same. Okay? So now you're down to about 2,500 shootings a year, deaths a year in the United States, in a country of 360 million people. And I'm not sure if that includes defensive uses of firearms. It may very well. I don't think they're all considered homicides, but I don't know if any of them are justifiable. But it's certainly probable that there are. So you would have to even reduce that number even more to get down to where a guy goes and kills people with a gun because he's mad, or because he murdered his wife with a gun because he was mad, or whatever. So, you're looking at 2,500 deaths a year in a country of 360 million people. I'll tell you, more people are killed with their friggin' cell phones out on the highway because they're texting their wife to complain about Trump. Right? I bring a chicken home for dinner and I don't like Trump. Right? Boom. And they kill someone in their friggin' car. Those people are way more of a menace than all the militiamen in the hills of West Virginia with their AK-47s. Yeah. And that's just a fact, Mark. Yeah. It's just a fact. So, people need to get realistic. Could we tweak our laws? Yes, we could. And frankly, I think the NRA in the States and in Canada, the CSSA or the NFA or all the different firearms groups, we should get together and propose our own laws to the government. And, we would have to tighten some things, which would hurt. But if we tighten those things and the laws were reasonable, I think they would loosen up other things. I don't know what we would get with the Liberals. I don't know that there's any reason to them. But the idea would be that you would make proposals that enhance public safety, because that's what we all want. Gun owners and non-gun owners alike. We all want enhanced public safety. So let's propose some rules that we think will work, that we can all live with, right? Yep. And then you get to the point of saying, like, listen, it is a free society, and with freedom comes responsibility and comes consequence. So, you know, if you're a bad person, you do bad things, you're going to suffer the consequence. We live in a free society. You know, people are going to misuse cars. They're going to misuse chainsaws. They're going to misuse power boats. They're going to misuse aircraft. They're going to misuse shotguns and AR-15s. That's going to happen. It's a measure of a society, a level of society's freedom as to whether or not the populace are armed. I don't want to live in a country that is disarmed. I just don't. It's, to me, it's just a padded jail cell.
Yeah.
You know, you're a ward of the state, and the state will protect you. Maybe if it feels like it. You know, if you don't have a bunch of gutless freaking cowards cowering outside because their police chief wants to make a point.
And this is exactly why I love talking to you, Brian. I got to tell you, you know what? Always a pleasure having you here on the show. That's about all the time that we have today. And you know what? I can't tell you enough how much I enjoy speaking with you. Every time it's just something new and exciting. Please, folks, if you haven't spread this around, we'd love to get our podcasts out there. Please don't forget to like and subscribe to the Instagram and the Facebook page, and watch us on YouTube. And as always, Canada, don't forget to shoot straight, stay safe.